Imagine you're 10 years old. The school bus drops you off. You walk down a quiet street, and you let yourself into an empty house with a heavy metal key that hangs from a string around your neck. There are no footsteps inside. There are no adults, no tracking apps, and no notifications waiting to tell you what to do next. You drop your backpack, make a snack, and for the next few hours, you are the absolute master of your own time. By today's standards, society might look back at this era and call it benign neglect. We're conditioned to assume that a childhood without constant supervision, curated enrichment, and protective boundaries must have been dangerous or irresponsible. But when you look at how your nervous system actually developed in that environment, that explanation does not quite land. What if I told you that your lack of supervision wasn't a deficit, but the exact training ground that forged an unshakable psychological resilience? What if you aren't just nostalgic for a simpler time, but your brain is actually calibrated for a world that simply no longer exists? Before we uncover the hidden psychology behind the wiring of the last truly free generation, I want you to do something right now. Drop a comment below and tell me, what was the one unspoken rule of your childhood neighborhood that you had to figure out entirely on your own? To understand how the minds of 80s kids operate today, we have to look at the physical reality of how you were raised. You grew up in a rare window in modern history where freedom wasn't symbolic, it was physical. When you left the house on a Saturday morning, you were a ghost. Your bicycle wasn't just a toy, it was an escape pod, your horse, and your first taste of raw power. You navigated neighborhoods, woods, and empty lots using intuition and trial and error, and the only rule was to be back before the streetlights flickered on. You didn't learn about danger from a warning label or an instructional video. You learned it by living inside your body. You climbed trees that were too high, rode bikes without helmets, and learned the physics of the world by falling onto unyielding asphalt. But here's the psychological truth about that physical risk. It developed your brain's threat assessment perfectly. Your nervous system learned to distinguish between real danger and manageable risk. Every scraped knee and bruised elbow taught your amygdala that pain hurts, but it isn't catastrophic. This is exactly why, in adulthood, chaos does not scramble you the way it seems to rattle others. When a crisis hits, your first instinct isn't to dramatize the problem. It is to assess, stabilize, and solve. Your body learned early that urgency does not require panic. This brings us to a fascinating psychological paradox involving a single dangerous sentence every child of the 80s quickly learned to avoid: "I'm bored." You learned early on that if you said those words out loud, an adult would hand you a chore. So you learned to solve boredom before it solved you. Today, modern childhood treats boredom like a threat, an emergency that must be immediately neutralized by a screen. But your nervous system learned that boredom is not an emergency, it is the birthplace of creativity and inner purpose. Without an algorithm telling you where to look, your attention turned inward. You took apart old radios to see how they worked. You spent hours making the perfect mixtape, and you learned how to sit in a quiet room without needing to escape your own thoughts. But here's the plot twist, the unique evolutionary challenge that defined your specific generation. Right as your identity was solidifying, the digital revolution hit. You are the bridge generation. You vividly remember the analog world, memorizing phone numbers, using the card catalog at the library, and waiting a week to watch your favorite television show. You understood that information had a physical cost, and that waiting was a normal condition of life. And then, almost without warning, the ground shifted. You had to build the digital future while still carrying the analog responsibilities. Psychologically, you are bilingual. You can troubleshoot a spreadsheet and reset a router, but you also know how to fix a physical problem the old-school way. But this duality carries a hidden trap, a quiet cliffhanger that highly independent minds often fall into. When you grew up as a latchkey kid,
You didn't just learn how to be independent, you learned how to be invisible on purpose. Because no one was coming to rescue you, your brain learned to scan for problems, fix them fast, and make no noise. You learned that your needs were secondary and that you had to handle your emotions alone. In adulthood, this hyper-independence morphs into the workhorse, the reliable one, the person who holds everyone else together while silently neglecting yourself.
You carry an entire family ecosystem on your shoulders, often caught in the sandwich generation, caring for aging parents and anxious children at the same time. And when you are drowning, you don't ask for help. You just say, "I'm fine," and keep working until your body forces you to stop. People often mistake your stoicism for cynicism. They look at the classic 80s whatever attitude and assume you don't care. But the reality is exactly the opposite. Whatever is not apathy, it is emotional armor. You grew up watching the Challenger explode on live television. You watched institutions crack, and you survived the relentless marketing of early mall culture. Your BS detector is flawless. You don't trust shiny stories or sudden trends because you have been trained by experience to keep your expectations grounded. You refuse to give your heart to something fake, and the only language you truly respect is raw, unfiltered authenticity. Feeling a step out of rhythm with today's loud, hyper-visible world does not mean you are outdated or broken. It simply means you are carrying a profound, quiet strength that is becoming extinct. You learned who you were without a digital footprint. You built a self without an audience, and you learned how to survive when no one was watching. But the ultimate goal of psychological growth isn't just surviving alone forever. It is unlearning the belief that you must always carry the weight of the world in silence. It is realizing that independence does not have to mean isolation, and that you are finally allowed to be held in the very same way you have held everyone else. If this video helped you recognize yourself or understand someone you love, you are not alone here. This channel is a space for understanding the quieter psychological patterns that shape how we think, connect, and move through the world. If you found this meaningful, consider subscribing so you do not miss future conversations. And remember to drop a comment below about your own journey. Your perspective might help someone else finally feel understood. Thank you for watching.